Okay, welcome back to the final part of chapter 7. Hopefully your week has been going good. I am willing to walk through this chapter with you finally, and hopefully you actually have something planned up this weekend. Okay, so far we've been looking at finance and lending and borrowing decisions. Okay, and the important thing about lending and borrowing decisions is that how much you lend, okay, and how much you end up borrowing, or how much you decide to invest in, we see is usually determined by the interest rate, okay? So we did see how to calculate interest rate, and we said if we have the price of an asset, right, and we have the amount of interest paid, okay, the interest rate, which is basically small I, right, equals I, which is basically the interest paid, times divided by the price of the asset times 100. Okay, so that is basically the interest rate. Okay, well, economists are really picky. In chapter 4 you did see that when we decide to differentiate between real GDP and nominal GDP, majority of the interest rates that are normally calculated for banks, or when you actually go for a loan, or you go for a mortgage, or you go for a car payment or a car purchase, those interest rates are what we call the nominal interest rate. Okay, so the nominal interest rate is the interest rate which is basically quoted without taking price changes into account. In other words, without taking inflation into account, and that is the nominal interest rate. Okay, so the nominal interest rate is just the normal interest rates we see on loans or financial assets. Okay, and again, it's calculated the same way as we calculate our interest rate. Okay, so small I is our interest rate, or our nominal interest rate, should equal the price of the asset, right, all divided by I, which is the interest paid. So the interest paid divided by price of the asset times 100, and that is our nominal interest rate. Okay, so you go to the bank, right, the interest rate being quoted is the normal interest rate. You go purchase a car, the interest rate quoted is the nominal interest rate, right? You buy a treasury bill, interest quoted is the nominal interest rate. You basically secure a loan for a mortgage is the nominal interest rate, which is generally used. Okay, right? So for example, if the annual interest rate paid in a $500 loan is $25, then the nominal interest rate is just a normal interest rate you've been looking for, which is 5%. So it's going to be 25, which is the interest paid divided by the price, okay, all times 100, and you should end up with 5%. Okay, should end up with 5%. Okay, right, so that is the nominal interest rate. And then we have what we call the real interest rate. So the real interest rate is basically the interest rate which accounts for price changes and which accounts for inflation. Now, going forward, we are always going to be using the real interest rate. Why? Because no country or no single economy has single or zero inflation rate. Okay, so every single country has an inflation rate at some point. Okay, so inflation basically erodes the value of money. Okay, so it actually affects the interest you actually earn on money, because over time, due to inflation, the value of that money reduces. Okay, so the real interest rate actually looks at the true interest by accounting for price changes or accounting for inflation. The real interest rate is defined as the nominal interest rate. Okay, so you have nominal, I'll just use N, minus the inflation rate, and we normally use pi for the inflation rate, equals the real interest rate. The reason we're subtracting inflation rate from it is that we are accounting for the change in inflation. Okay, so for example, if the nominal interest rate is 5% a year, and for that year the inflation rate was 2%, well, then the real interest rate after accounting for inflation and the loss of value in money is basically going to be 3%. Okay, right, so that is how we calculate the real interest rate. Now, interest rates are really important for financial markets. Okay, interest rates actually sort of determine what happens in the financial market, right? And in looking at financial market, we'll look at a simple model what we call the loanable funds market, right? Now, as economists, we want to know how, if all investment decisions and all savings decisions happen simultaneously in financial markets, how will the financial markets itself behave? How will the economy behave? How can we predict interest rates? How can we predict investments? How can we predict savings? Okay, that is what we want to do. Okay, so to do that, we actually look at the market for loanable funds. Okay, and the market for loanable funds is the aggregate of all individual financial markets. Okay, so you look at every single financial market, which basically consists of investors, and savers, or investments and savings. Okay, and a culmination of all these financial markets into one huge market called the loanable funds market. Okay, so the loanable funds market is really important because it determines the real interest rate, right, in a market, the quantity of funds loaned, savings, the quantity of savings in the market, and investment. Okay, so these are the 4 key things you need to know, that the culmination of financial markets determine the real interest rate, the quantity of funds loaned, the savings and amount of investment in the economy. Okay, right, every time you hear the word market, okay, you should always think of demand and supply. In economics, it's always about demand and supply. Okay, so again, we're going to look at the demand side of the loanable funds market. Okay, now the demand for loanable funds market, think of it as borrowing. Remember, firms borrow generally to invest in the financial markets. Okay, so firms basically borrow to actually make an investment, right? An investment into some assets or into some capital to grow the economy. Okay, so the quantity of loanable funds demanded is the funds demanded to finance an investment. Again, think of this as borrowing for investment. Okay, so borrowing for investment. Okay, and the quantity of loanable funds demanded depends on the real interest rate. Okay, so the quantity of loanable funds demanded is synonymous with the real interest rate, or it depends on the real interest rate. Okay, so think about it, right? The amount you decide to borrow, or the amount a business will borrow, depends on the interest rate that business is going to end up paying in the long run. Okay, right, so the quantity of loanable funds demanded depends on the interest rate, whilst expected profit affects the demand for loanable funds. Okay, so expected profit affects the demand for loanable funds, and the real interest rate affects the quantity of loanable funds demanded. Remember, there's a difference between quantity of loanable funds demanded and the demand for loanable funds. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at is the demand for loanable funds curve, and the demand for loanable funds curve basically shows us the relationship between the real interest rate. So think of the real interest rate as the price. Remember, we said price and quantity in chapter 3. Think of the real interest rate as the price of investment, or the price of quantity of loanable funds demanded. Okay, so the demand for loanable funds is basically a relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds demanded, or the amount essentially borrowed. Every time you see the word quantity of loanable funds demanded, think of borrowing for investment. Again, I can't stress how important that is. Okay, so borrowing for investment. Okay, now think about it. When the interest rates are really high, are you more likely to borrow, or are you less likely to borrow? When the interest rates are really high, are you likely more to make an investment? At least think of investment in the sense of investment where firms actually buy capital, or are you less likely to make an investment? Well, if you remember, when the NPV, right, when the interest rate is basically high, the NPV, which depends on the interest rate and the price and the present value, right, becomes smaller. So when the interest rate tends to be high, the net present value becomes smaller and firms don't invest as much. Conversely, when the interest rate is really low, the NPV is higher, the net present value is higher, and firms tend to invest more. Okay, at the same time, think of it from your own perspective. When the interest rate is really high, you tend to borrow less. Okay, so the quantity of loanable funds demanded decreases. Okay, and when the real interest rate decreases, when interest rates are really low, you're more likely to borrow because you don't have to pay so much interest, okay? Right, so there's a negative relationship between the real interest rate and the demand for loanable funds, okay? There's a negative relationship between the real interest rate and the demand for loanable funds. And we can actually see that graph, okay? So in drawing our graph, we basically have real interest rate on our y-axis. We have loanable funds on our x-axis. And we have the demand for loanable funds curve, which looks at the relationship between real interest rate and the quantity demanded of loanable funds, okay? A rise in the real interest rate decreases, again, is the quantity of loanable funds demanded, okay? So when interest rates rise, okay, you move upward along the demand for loanable funds curve, and the quantity of loanable funds demanded decreases, okay? Conversely, when interest rates fall, you move downward along the demand for loanable funds curve, and quantity of loanable funds demanded increases, okay? So just like demand, right, there's a negative relationship between what we call price of loanable funds, which is the real interest rate, okay, because if you're going to borrow, that's the price it basically costs you, or that's how much it costs you to borrow, right? And the quantity, which is basically just the loanable funds in the market, okay? And then we have changes in the demand for loanable funds. Changes in the demand for loanable funds comes from when expected profit changes. Okay, when expected profit changes. When expected profits changes, the demand for loanable funds would change, meaning there's an entire shift in the demand curve. Okay, so an entire shift. If I can get time to write that. Yep, so that's how my shift looks like, okay? So entire shift in the demand curve, okay? When expected profit increases, or the greater the expected profit, the more there is demand to actually invest, and the greater the demand for loanable funds, okay? If a firm knows that it's going to make higher profits by investing, by borrowing and investing into an asset, okay, then the firm is actually going to invest more in the asset, or the firm is actually going to take the pleasure in investing in the asset, okay? So basically, the greater the expected profit, okay, the higher the investment and the more the loanable funds demanded, okay? And conversely, the lower the expected profit, the lower is the amount of investment, and hence the lower the greater the demand for loanable funds. The next thing we'll look at is the supply of loanable funds, okay? And remember I said supply of loanable funds. Remember, if quantity of loanable funds demanded is borrowing, supply of loanable funds has to do with savings. Okay, because again, the money you end up saving is the money that is actually lent out to other people. Okay, so supply of loanable funds has to do with savings, and the quantity of loanable funds supplied is the total funds available from private saving, and if the government is running a budget surplus. Okay, so sometimes the government runs a budget deficit, right? So it's from private saving and the government budget surplus. Okay, the supply of loanable funds depends on the quantity supplied of the quantity of loanable funds supplied depends on the real interest rate. Again, the real interest rate influences the quantity of loanable funds supplied, not the supply of loanable funds. It's the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Okay, right. And also, the supply of loanable funds itself depends on disposable income. When disposable income increases, savings tend to be greater because you have more money to end up saving, okay? So savings actually increase, okay? When disposable income decreases, savings tend to decrease, so the supply of loanable funds tend to decrease because you have less amount to save. expected future income. When you know that you're going to make a lot of money in the future, your current savings will actually decrease. You decide to spend more and splurge because you know that you have a big income coming up in the future. Okay? If your expected future income is going to be low, you know that in the future you're going to go broke, you decide to save more today. Okay? So expected future income influences savings. Wealth also influences savings. The more wealth you have, the less likely you are to save because your wealth keeps on growing. And the less wealth you have, the more likely you are to save because you want to build on your wealth. Okay? And then finally, we have what we call default risk. And default risk is the likelihood of a person not paying their loan. Okay? If the default risk is high, if the likelihood of a person not paying their loan is high, or people not paying their loans is high, you're less willing to save because you know that if you save and lend, you're not going to get your money back. If the default risk, on the other hand, is low, you know that people are actually going to end up paying your money, so you're more likely to save and lend. Okay? So, in that sense, the supply of loanable funds curve, again, just like demand, looks at the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds supplied and the real interest rate, holding all other factors constant. Okay? And just like with supply in chapter 3, there's a positive relationship between the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Okay? So when the real interest rate increases, the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases as well. Why? Well, think about it. If a bank is paying a high interest rate on your savings, you decide to put more money in the bank. If the bank decides to increase the interest rate further, well, you put more money in the bank to actually capitalize on the increase in interest rate. Okay? Conversely, if the interest rate at the bank is really low, why put your money there in the first place? You basically get nothing. Okay? So the quantity supplied of loanable funds will decrease as well. Okay? So in that sense, there's a positive relationship between the supply of loanable funds, the quantity supplied of loanable funds, and the real interest rate. And the figure looks something like this. Okay, it looks like an upward sloping supply curve, which we've already seen before. So this is nothing new, and this is nothing basically esoteric. Okay, right. So a rise in the real interest rate will lead to an upward movement along the supply of loanable funds curve. Okay, because the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases. And a fall in the real interest rate will lead to a movement downward the supply of loanable funds curve because the quantity of loanable funds supplied decreases. Okay, so changes in the supply of loanable funds. Well, all other external factors such as a change in disposable income, a change in expected future income, wealth, or default risk basically changes the supply of loanable funds. Okay, now once we have this, now we can look at equilibrium. Remember, economists are always concerned about equilibrium because equilibrium is where everything basically is perfect, where supply or quantity supplied of loanable funds will equal quantity demanded of loanable funds at a certain equilibrium interest rate and at a certain equilibrium quantity. Okay, so the loanable funds market tends to be in equilibrium at a real interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded equals the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Okay, now we can see equilibrium right here. Okay, so at 6%, where the real interest rate is 6%, right, we have the point where quantity supplied of loanable funds equals quantity demanded of loanable funds. The real interest rate is 6%, so hence that is our equilibrium real interest rate. And also the quantity of loanable funds demanded and supplied at the same time is 2 trillion. So that is our equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Okay. Now, if the real interest rate is basically 7%, right, the quantity of loanable funds supplied exceeds the quantity of loanable funds demanded. There are more savers than borrowers in the economy or in the financial market. Right, so the surplus, there is a surplus of funds, And every time there's a surplus in the market, right, prices will be forced down. So the interest rate will be forced down till it actually reaches the point of equilibrium. Likewise, if the interest rate is 5% and below the market's equilibrium, there are more borrowers in the market than there are savers. Okay, so the interest rate will be forced up, okay, till it reaches the point of equilibrium. Now let's look at an increase in demand for loanable funds. What happens? Well, we know that an increase in demand for loanable funds, the demand curve is always going to shift to the right. An increase in demand has to do with the demand curve shifting to the right, okay? So let's say an increase in expected profits increase the demand for loanable funds, okay? The demand curve will basically shift to the right. What will happen? The real interest rate, you compare the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium. You compare the old one, which is this one, to the new one, okay? And you see that the real interest rate increases, okay? But when the real interest rate increases, there's a movement along the supply of loanable funds curve. So the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases. And since the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases, right, it also increases our savings. Because remember again, the quantity of loanable funds supplied is synonymous with savings. Savings influence a huge part of the quantity of loanable funds supplied, okay? So when the real interest rate increases, people become more likely to save, and it actually makes sense, okay? Hence, the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases as well. Well, what about if the supply of loanable funds increase? If the supply of loanable funds increase, maybe due to an increase in disposable income, okay, we have a rightward shift of the supply curve, and we can see that from the old equilibrium to the new equilibrium, basically interest rates decrease, okay? But what will happen to the quantity of loanable funds demanded, because we're moving along the demand for loanable funds curve, okay? We know that interest rates will decrease, right? But the real interest rates will actually influence investment to increase and the quantity of loanable funds demanded to increase as well, okay? So when the supply of loanable funds increases, the real interest rate will decrease. When the real interest rate decreases, people will like to invest more because they get higher net present value, okay? And also, it's really cheap to borrow, so why not borrow, okay? So real interest rate decreases, people borrow more, and by borrowing more, they actually invest more, okay? So the real interest rate basically falls. At this point, if you don't understand anything, I suggest you pause the video and try and go back and make sure you actually understand before we decide to move on.